The Dillen Doll, Chapter 6, and if it be true what they're saying. There were certain taverns, inns and public houses thereabouts, which were seen to be forever thriving, forever bustling and busy. They seemed to boast a perpetual liveliness, spiced by the camaraderie and bonhomie of a regular exclusive clientele. The drink on offer might vary dramatically in taste and quality, not only from house to house but from day to day in any given establishment, and the price of it, not to mention the effect that it had on its imbiber, undoubtedly played a part in such an equation. But the sheer number of people in a city like Newcastle ensured that dry throats and loose coinage were always in evidence, as were the hijinks and conviviality that they brought with them. The traditions that bind one man to one alehouse and his neighbour, or even his brother, to another place, perhaps situated on the same street, are unspoken and unfathomable. The trade skills and political allegiances of certain groups of men are likely to dictate the parlours where they've congregated for years, perhaps by way of convenience or proximity. Very few men along the Tyne varied their lifetime habits in matters of the bottle or the cask, and they were enough in numbers to ensure that many establishments were sure of a full house on any night of the week. For the women thereabouts, unless domestic employment excused it, choices were few, and indeed many of the female sex were content in the knowledge that it wasn't acceptable that they should even consider frequenting these places. For those that did, and who were shameless or oblivious enough to care little what it did for their reputations, only a very few houses were known to welcome or even tolerate them. Taverns like the Flying Horse or the Black Boy, within calling distance of the river itself, or the Swan at the corner of Pudding Chair in Collingwood Street, higher up towards the heart of the old city, were lively, enticing and entertaining places, brimming over with noise and tall tales. Occasional fists would be raised, or even knives drawn, but those were rare and unwelcome occurrences for men whose wit and muscle had to be keen enough to survive a day's toil at their regular labour. The flickering lights and easy talk of the public houses of Sandgate were its very heartbeat, and had been that way for as long as memory professed it. But there were other drinking places that crawled through a meagre existence for just as long as a duration, yet for the opposite reasons. Places where men go in search of solitude and escape, where social niceties can be washed away in cheap liquor and problems quenched in tasteless, foamless ale. The darkness therein hides both incipient dirt and troubled emotion in one arc of a drinker's arm. The clientele relish the chance to be undisturbed, unpestered and anonymous. Their number is forever few, their voices invariably silent. The Bunch of Grapes was once such a place, and by chance lay within walking distance of the house of Alec Parish, which itself stood uncomfortably close to the Ballast Banks at Byker. He was wont to enter its jagged-edged door perhaps 3 times a week, though never at weekends. It had been a Monday, in fact, some 3 weeks earlier, when he had been surprised to hear his own name being whispered in a quiet but shamelessly quizzical tone at the half-open hatch at which the heavy-set, sullen landlord grudgingly had cause to pour out his wares into unmatched and unattractive drinking vessels, as and when his attention could be summoned. Parish himself had been sat in thought, crouched towards a reluctant fire in the back of the grate of a stone fireplace at the furthest end of the room. A tall figure with a young man's bearing was at the hatch, and it was from his lightly bearded lips that the whisper had emerged. The landlord, to his credit, had responded by slamming the hatch closed without a word, but Parish's own noticeably curious response had been all the information that the young man needed. His eyes focused on Parish, and with serious brows and a nervous pout on his lips, his head gave a cautious bow of greeting. Alec Parish's mind lashed out in search of a quick and suitable reaction, but he had been unprepared for it. Already the stranger was advancing towards him, passing the open-mouthed sleeping figure of the room's only other customer and momentarily presenting himself at Parish's side. Alec cursed for allowing himself to be caught out like this. He stared wordlessly up at the man for as long a time as he could muster. Eventually the other spoke, once more in a halting, breathless whisper. "Mr. Parish, sir?" There was no response forthcoming. He continued despite this. "My name is Turnbull, Elijah Turnbull. We have mutual," he hesitated, "acquaintances. They have directed me to you in the hope that I might beg of your counsel." He looked around the room, dismissing the sleeping occupant as he did so. "Concerning a certain matter that may be of interest to you." Still Parrish offered no acknowledgement. He continued to stare, the 2 beakers of ale he had quaffed earlier refusing to relax their grip on his reactions. "May I sit?" Turnbull asked. Parrish told himself to play for time and inclined his head in the direction of the nearest chair. Turnbull pulled it closer, and the rasp of its legs on the coarse floor woke up the sleeper with a jolt. The man looked around briefly, picked up his cup, and discovering it to be empty, breathed heavily and stood up. He lurched towards the door with a belch and was gone. The other 2 watched him depart. Turnbull looked relieved and leaned in towards Parrish. "Elijah Turnbull, as I say, is my name," he said. "My employment past these 20 months has been as a clerk to the town council, with a position at the port office, adjacent to the guild hall. Perhaps you are familiar with it." Parrish looked away, feigning disinterest. In truth, these few words of introduction had piqued his curiosity somewhat. Turnbull continued, "No matter, my responsibilities are many and mainly laborious and mundane, but I have a facility for figures, accounting and the like. My employers want to tell me that I have brought a certain degree of clarity to the city's ledgers that was sadly lacking before my hiring." He allowed himself a self-satisfied smile. "But make no mistake, sir, despite their carefree profferings of their innermost financial affairs, I am not privy to their machinations, and I am my own mind, sir, with my own principles and standards. I take pride in my work, naturally, but I have no desire or ambition to cast my lot in with my betters for my own self-aggrandizement. I work for the city and its people, not for the privileged chambers and self-serving patrons who have found themselves in corruptible positions of advantage." He looked quickly behind him at the empty room and leaned in further. "Yes, sir, corruption, and nothing less than that, is that of which I speak." Parrish was relaxed enough now in this man's company to observe him somewhat more thoroughly. His young face, framed in dark hair and soft whiskers, was shiny with sweat. His clothes were correct but shabby. His boots were wet and bruised with coaly mud. In one hand he held the peak of a cleric's cap, in the other the handle of a wide-covered satchel, much used and long carried. At last Parrish felt confident enough to utter a word. "Who?" he asked, to the other man's surprised consternation. "You said mutual acquaintances. Who?" In an even more earnest and quieter whisper, Turnbull mentioned a name and then another. The sweating increased visibly as he did so, and the sound of them, Parrish was surprised and impressed in equal measures. These were names not to be bandied about in common company, names that would mean nothing to most men in a city street, but in the dark alleys and damp cellars that led off them, these were names that invoked a potent mixture of fear and respect. Clearly this man Turnbull had gone to great lengths to bring himself to his present location. "I was directed firstly to them by way of lesser men, but more earnest men perhaps, then in turn mentioned yourself as one who would be most interested in what I have to say, and who could choose a most fitting course of action." There was a certain ring of probability in these words, but Parrish remained sceptical. What information could a mere town clerk possess that would illuminate this apparent myriad of deception and intrigue, such that it would ally him with villains and schemers from both sides of the law, and then ultimately seek out a stranger such as himself to act as a confidant? He stared at Turnbull blankly, then allowed himself an ambivalent shrug of the shoulders. The other took that as a cue to continue. "I take it, sir," he resumed, "that you are familiar with the methods by which the hostmen and the council of this port manage and control the traffic of wares within and without, whether it be coal, spices, local produce, other commodities, back and forth, in order to ensure a standardised and efficient, not to say cost-effective management of what is rapidly becoming the second most important trading point in this country, second only to the port of London." Another mild shrug from Parrish came forth. "And are you aware, sir, to what extent the commercial interests of the horsemen, private interests I would emphasise, have become entwined with the affairs of the port and the city in which it serves? Moreover, entwined with the affairs of the men, those very men who have sworn to uphold righteousness and to act on behalf of good fortune of this city. Those men, sir, who, with regret, I have discovered to be less and less concerned with the benevolence of the people who they claim to serve, and more concerned with serving themselves and the weight of their own purses." Turnbull was spitting out these words in a growing frenzy by now. Parrish watched him and offered a loaded comment. "Corruption among city officials is expected and weathered," he said mildly, "and many's the mighty empire across history that has experienced it and has paid a harsh cost for it. I, for one, do not condone it, but I am enough of a realist to know it is insurmountable as the curse, the plague that it is. Where there are scraps from the table, the rats congregate and grow fat as a result." Turnbull had lost his trepidation and cautiousness by now. His voice has also outgrown the preliminary whisper. "A realist, sir, you say?" he scolded. "I would profess the same position to you myself, naturally, and as for accepting it with reluctant acquiescence, it is a regrettable necessity of my job. But I tell you, sir, that it is a feature which has taken on a new and more sinister hue in recent weeks. Then perhaps you will understand why I have taken upon myself to present the details to you, here in this place." His eyes darted around the stagnant corners about him. "And at some risk and chance of danger to myself, I assure you. I know you not, sir, and I am not in the habit of breaking bread with these men whose names I have shared with you just now, and yet my feelings of disgust and my beliefs in justice have prevailed upon me to do so. I would ask you at last to take them seriously." Alec Parrish by now had summoned up this young man as a naive fool, but a genuine honest fool, with a rich earnestness that he found curiously entertaining. He was not offended by that last remark, and the instinctive wariness felt at his initial approach was already melting into curiosity. He made an open-handed gesture of compliance and allowed Mr. Turnbull to pour out the details of his position. Nothing he said was beyond belief, no detail was unfathomable, no assertion seemed preposterous or far-fetched, and the conclusions reached seemed plausible and decisive. As Turnbull ended his soliloquy of intricacy, with much talk of underhand contracts, mutual advantages and cold-blooded profligacy, the young man sat back in near exhaustion, as if finally unburdened of a load that had weighed him down for a long, long time. That load had now transferred itself onto new shoulders, and Alec Parrish felt invigorated and inspired by the bulk of it. A silence fell between the two men. Parrish's eyes were as unseeing as his mind was drenched in clarity. What little certainty of livelihood and ambition there was in this town was to be usurped and betrayed by the very men in whom which the people had put their trust. The false gavel of injustice resonated through every strata of society and flowed as surely and as unstoppable as the river itself. Now, thanks to an unprincipled clerk tainted by the underestimation of his employers, there was a slim chance that something could be done about it. But what exactly? Parrish spoke. "The main advantage that lies in the hands of those who are set on this scheme," he said slowly to the dry air between them, "seems to be the veil of secrecy that covers their plans. That in itself is governed by timing and appropriate placing of many separate elements in their scheme. It's on too grand a scale by this point for any individual to approach it from the outside and expose it. It's too complicated, too intricate a web to be exposed to a common light." Turnbull bridled slightly at this, but Parrish continued regardless. "But if it can be made known to them that their subterfuge and long-term plan was itself known to others, even anonymously, that might give them cause to be somewhat circumspect, somewhat concerned. It would certainly slow them down a pace." Parrish's thoughts were rampant. The mellowness caused by the ale, the entrancing complexity of this man's tale had inspired him, stirring feelings that life had spared him for too long. He leaned forward and gripped the startled Turnbull's arms in an act of firm resolve. "Your role is crucial in this," he said, "and it is crucial too that your part in it is not exposed. Your knowledge and authority will undoubtedly be needed if things come to fruition as I hope." Turnbull looked perplexed, as if regret and fear had won the day in his young heart. "What do you propose to do?" he asked in a whisper, claiming his voice once more. "Be it known, I will have no part in lawlessness, violence and such like." Parrish smiled thinly at him. "No, I've no fear of that," he replied. "The men themselves are not the target of my resolve. It is the plans, the contracts, the authority that they represent that we should take desired possession of. You must merely make known to me the arrangements of this office of yours, and the whereabouts of these precious things that mean so much to our friends in high places." You need play no further part in it. Indeed, this is likely to be our one and only meeting, to the relief of both of us, no doubt. You mean to steal these documents? Turnbull asked, his eyes widening. But would that be enough of a recourse? The plans are already afoot, schemes are in motion. It would be recourse enough to delay them, to give cause for concern. That knowledge of these things has escaped beyond the elegant walls in which this spell has been cast. And if I'm any judge of the characters of these men, it will not be long before weak will and suspicion pokes a trembling finger in the dam of silence. These are ambitious, greedy men, but weak and untrusting. Wary eyes are needed to break laws on this scale, and survival inspires betrayal. It will not be long before this castle of cards crumbles upon itself, and it will be at that point that they can be exposed, and at which time you can play your part in all innocence, in all fidelity. So you don't mean that I conspire with you, Turnbull said in visible relief, but you cannot do it alone, and I am wary of involving others. One other, Parrish replied softly, a man of principle like yourself, with a strong heart, a knowledge of the river, and one whom I trust beyond any other. He is no stranger to just causes, and has never shied away from them. It'll be a trifle for him, a mere prank, but carried out with all haste and good intention. Parrish looked at Turnbull with a firm eye. There are details that you must make known to me before you leave. After that, go home, forget this conversation. It is not I who will next come to you if our plan goes well. It will be the good people of this town, if such folk do indeed remain here.